Viral pro-Trump tweets are coming from fake African-American spam accounts, Twitter says, and it's taking them down. The spammers are posing as black people leaving the Democratic Party in support of President Trump. NBC News reporter Ben Collins joins me now. Ben, tell us more about what happened here and how Twitter found out about it.
Sure. So one of these tweets went extremely viral and was also very fishy. It was an account that said, look, I'm a lifelong Democrat. I'm going to vote Republican this year. This was on, Wednesday of the RNC. You could say, I'm done with this trash. I'll be registering Republican. I got 13,000 retweets. And people were like, I don't really know about this. It kind of appears that this profile picture is a Dutch model, which it was. And I talked to that Dutch model, and he was pretty nervous about his identity being stolen. And it was pretty rough. So Twitter was like, OK, we should look into this. They found a spam network around this account, and also another account called Kron619 had 38,000 followers and had 5 retweets, by the way, that had over 5 tweets that had over 10,000 retweets. So these are extraordinarily viral things tied to a spam operation that was pushing these pro-Trump messages pretending to be African Americans.
Ben, Twitter says it's seen an increase in copy pasta, an attempt to copy, paste, and tweet the same phrase, and that it may limit the visibility of those tweets. For non-super techies like me, copy pasta is a new term. What else should average people who don't necessarily have your tech knowledge, what should we be watching out for here? What are other signs that the tweets you might be reading or the posts that you're seeing on social media are fake?
So copy pasta is a thing that was used by trolls for a long period of time, just to joke around and mess around with services. Now it appears it's being used for political purposes. This was a 4chan thing, it was a Reddit thing, and now it's becoming sort of a Twitter thing to joke around about politics or to seed these political messages. And that's what you should look for. If you see the same tweet being tweeted over and over again underneath the replies of a famous person, a politician, somebody's breaking news, that's what copy pasta is. That's done to simulate support for a group of people that really doesn't have that much support. It's astroturfing, and that's what happened here. Some of these accounts, they weren't just retweeted 10,000 times. Those messages were then posted onto other fake African American accounts that were created this month. So this is a coordinated thing. We don't know exactly who's behind it, but we do know this is not authentic. This is very artificial behavior.
And it's probably something we're going to see a lot more of as the election gets closer. Ben Collins, thanks so much for talking us through it. And now I know what copy pasta is. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.